The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old royal guard, stood at his post with the same dedication he had shown for the past 5 years. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, his black boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearskin hat sat precisely as regulation demanded. But today would be different from all the others. Marcus had grown up in a small town outside London, the son of a factory worker and a school teacher. His parents had instilled in him strong values about right and wrong, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. These values had guided him through his military service and eventually led him to seek a position as a royal guard. It was an honor few received, and Marcus took the responsibility seriously. The palace grounds were busier than usual that Tuesday morning. A state visit was scheduled for later in the week, and preparations were in full swing. Gardeners trimmed hedges to perfection, maintenance workers cleaned every visible surface, and security personnel conducted their routine sweeps. Marcus observed it all from his position near the main gates, his trained eyes scanning for anything unusual. Around 10:30, he noticed a small group gathering near the palace fence. This wasn't uncommon. Tourists often collected there, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty or simply to take photos. But something about this particular group caught his attention. There was tension in their posture, raised voices that carried across the distance, though he couldn't make out the words. Among the group was a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with curly brown hair tied in pigtails. She wore a bright yellow dress and clutched a small bouquet of flowers. Her face was lit with excitement as she pressed close to the fence, clearly hoping to see someone from the royal family. Behind her stood what appeared to be her parents, a middle-aged couple who looked slightly overwhelmed by the crowd. The tension Marcus had sensed began to escalate. A man in an expensive suit was becoming increasingly agitated, his voice rising above the general murmur of the crowd. He appeared to be arguing with several other people about something, gesturing wildly with his hands. The little girl seemed oblivious to the conflict brewing around her, still focused on the palace beyond the fence. Marcus felt a familiar unease settling in his stomach. His military training had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to spiral out of control. The body language, the rising voices, the way people were positioning themselves, all the signs were there. He shifted slightly at his post, maintaining his ceremonial stance while keeping his attention fixed on the developing scene. The man in the suit was now shouting, though the specific words were still unclear from Marcus's distance. Other tourists were starting to back away, sensing the hostility. Parents pulled their children closer. The little girl's mother reached for her daughter's hand, but the child was still transfixed by the palace, unaware of the danger building behind her. Then Marcus saw the man's face clearly for the first time. Lord Pemberton, a minor aristocrat known for his short temper and sense of entitlement. Marcus had encountered him before during previous incidents at the palace. Pemberton had a history of creating scenes when things didn't go his way. But palace protocol was clear. Guards were not to intervene in civilian disputes unless directly ordered by their superiors or unless there was an immediate threat to royal security. The crowd continued to grow more restless. Pemberton's argument seemed to be with a photographer who had apparently taken his picture without permission. The photographer, a young man with multiple cameras hanging from his neck, was trying to defuse the situation, but Pemberton was having none of it. His face was red with anger, and Marcus could see the veins bulging in his neck even from his distant post. Marcus glanced toward the guard station, wondering if his supervisor had noticed the disturbance. But Captain Reynolds was inside, probably reviewing the day's security briefings. The other guards at nearby posts were maintaining their positions, eyes forward as they had been trained to do. Palace guards were expected to be like statues, unmoved by the chaos that might swirl around them. The little girl had finally noticed the commotion and turned around, her eyes wide with confusion and growing fear. Her parents were now trying to shepherd her away from the crowd, but the press of people made movement difficult. Marcus watched as she clutched her flowers tighter, the bright yellow of her dress a stark contrast to the dark mood that had settled over the scene. Pemberton's shouting reached a new level of intensity. He was now threatening the photographer, promising consequences that would ruin the man's career. The photographer continued to back away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, but Pemberton followed him, his anger seeming to feed on itself and grow stronger with each passing moment. Marcus felt his jaw clench involuntarily. Every instinct told him that this situation was about to explode into violence. But his orders were clear, his duty defined by centuries of tradition. Royal Guards did not abandon their posts. They did not interfere in civilian matters. They maintained their positions and protected the royal family, nothing more, nothing less. The little girl's mother finally managed to take her daughter's hand, pulling her back from the fence. But the crowd had formed a rough circle around the conflict and escape routes were limited. Marcus could see the fear in the child's eyes now, the way she pressed close to her mother's side, the flowers trembling in her small hand. Pemberton took another step toward the photographer, his fist raised. The moment of decision was approaching fast, and Marcus found himself caught between duty and conscience, between the oath he had sworn and the values his parents had taught him. The morning sun beat down on his red uniform as he stood frozen, watching a situation that would change everything. The explosion of violence came without warning. Lord Pemberton's fist connected with the photographer's jaw, sending the younger man stumbling backward into the crowd. Cameras clattered to the ground and people scattered like leaves in a storm. But in their panic to escape, something terrible happened. The little girl, still holding her mother's hand, was caught in the surge of fleeing tourists. Her small frame was no match for the adults pushing and shoving around her. Marcus watched in horror as she was separated from her parents, swept along by the crowd like a piece of driftwood in a raging river. Pemberton, his fury now completely unleashed, seemed oblivious to the chaos he had created. The photographer was on the ground, blood trickling from his mouth, trying to protect his expensive equipment from the trampling feet. But Pemberton wasn't finished. His eyes were wild with rage as he looked around for another target for his anger. That's when he saw the little girl. She had been pushed against the palace fence, her yellow dress now wrinkled and dirty. The bouquet of flowers lay scattered at her feet, the colorful petals already being crushed by the moving crowd. Tears streamed down her face as she called out for her parents, her small voice barely audible above the shouting and confusion. To Pemberton, in his twisted state of mind, she represented everything that was wrong with this situation. Too many people, too much noise, too much chaos interfering with his important business. His face darkened as he pushed through the remaining crowd toward the frightened child. Marcus felt his heart racing as he watched the scene unfold. His training told him to maintain his position, to trust that civilian authorities would handle the situation. But his training had never prepared him for watching a grown man advance on a helpless child with violence in his eyes. The girl's parents were desperately trying to push through the crowd to reach their daughter, but the mass of panicking tourists blocked their path. Marcus could hear the mother screaming her daughter's name, Emma, over and over again, her voice cracking with terror. Pemberton reached Emma first. The little girl looked up at the towering man with wide, frightened eyes. She pressed herself back against the fence as if trying to disappear into the iron bars. Her small hands were shaking as she whispered, "Please, sir, I want my mummy." But Pemberton was beyond reason. In his warped perception, this child was somehow responsible for his humiliation, for the photographer's defiance, for all the chaos swirling around him. His hand rose in the air and Marcus could see the intention written clearly on his face. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Marcus watched as Pemberton's hand began its downward arc toward the defenseless child. Emma raised her small arms to protect herself, a gesture so instinctive and heartbreaking that it cut through Marcus like a knife. In that frozen moment, Marcus heard his father's voice from years ago. "Son, there comes a time when you have to choose between following orders and doing what's right. When that time comes, I pray you choose right." His mother's words echoed alongside. The strong have a duty to protect the weak, no matter what the cost. The palace protocols, the centuries of tradition, the stern warnings from his superiors about maintaining discipline, all of it crumbled in the face of what he was witnessing. This wasn't about royal security or ceremonial duties. This was about a child who was about to be hurt by a man 3 times her size, and Marcus was the only person in position to stop it. His decision was made before his conscious mind had even processed it. Marcus broke from his position with a speed that surprised even himself. His heavy boots pounded against the cobblestones as he sprinted toward the fence, his ceremonial uniform suddenly feeling like armor as he prepared for battle. The distance that had seemed so vast from his post closed with shocking speed. Other guards noticed his movement immediately. He could hear Captain Reynolds's voice crackling through his radio, demanding to know what was happening, ordering him to return to his post. But Marcus couldn't hear the specific words anymore. His entire focus was on reaching Emma before Pemberton's hand could strike her. The crowd scattered further as they saw the Royal Guard charging toward them. Some people pointed and shouted, others raised phones to record what they sensed would be a historic moment. But Marcus was aware of none of this. His world had narrowed to a single point, the little girl cowering against the fence and the man about to hurt her. Pemberton's hand was inches from Emma's face when Marcus reached them. "Stop!" Marcus shouted with a voice that had been trained to carry commands across military battlefields. The word echoed off the palace walls with such authority that even Pemberton hesitated for a split second. That hesitation was all Marcus needed. He inserted himself between the Lord and the child, his imposing figure in the bright red uniform creating a barrier that Pemberton couldn't ignore. Marcus was several inches taller than the aristocrat and in far better physical condition. Facts that became immediately apparent to everyone watching. "Step away from the child, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This has gone far enough." Pemberton's face went from red to purple with rage. "How dare you interfere? Do you know who I am? I'll have your job, your career, everything. Guards don't tell their betters what to do." Behind Marcus, little Emma had stopped crying, her tear-stained face now looking up at her unexpected protector with something approaching hope. The flowers from her bouquet were still scattered around their feet, but she seemed to have forgotten about them entirely. Marcus could hear more guards approaching from behind, their heavy boots creating a drumbeat of impending confrontation. Captain Reynolds was shouting orders, demanding explanations, threatening consequences. The crowd had formed a wide circle around them, phones recording every moment of the unprecedented scene. But Marcus kept his eyes fixed on Pemberton. "I know exactly who you are, sir, and I know what's right and what's wrong. You will not hurt this child, not while I'm here to prevent it." The moment hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something that would change everything, not just for Marcus, but for the very idea of what it meant to be a royal guard. Lord Pemberton's eyes blazed with fury as he stared at the guard who dared to defy him. "You insignificant fool! Do you have any idea what you've done? I have connections that reach the highest levels of government. I'll see you court-martialed, stripped of everything, thrown into prison." Marcus remained perfectly still, his body positioned protectively between Pemberton and Emma. Behind him, he could feel the little girl's small hand clutch at his red uniform jacket, seeking comfort from her unlikely guardian. Her parents were still fighting through the crowd, their desperate calls growing closer. Captain Reynolds arrived with 3 other guards, their faces grim with the knowledge that protocol had been shattered. The captain was a career military man who had served with distinction for 22 years. His respect for chain of command and royal tradition was absolute, and seeing one of his men abandon his post was like watching his entire world collapse. "Guard Thompson," Reynolds barked, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. "Return to your position immediately. This is a direct order." Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. He had never disobeyed a direct order in his entire military career. The discipline that had been drilled into him since basic training screamed at him to obey, to step aside, to let others handle the situation. But Emma's small hand was still gripping his jacket, and he could feel her trembling behind him. "I cannot do that, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady but respectful. "This child is in immediate danger." Pemberton laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the tension like broken glass. "Danger from me? I was simply going to teach the brat some manners about staying out of the way of her betters. Children these days have no respect." The crowd that had gathered was growing larger by the minute. Tourists who had been visiting other parts of the palace grounds were drawn by the commotion, and word was spreading quickly through social media. Phones were recording from every angle, capturing a scene that would soon be viewed by millions around the world. Among the faces in the crowd, Marcus spotted Emma's parents finally breaking through. The mother reached them first, dropping to her knees and pulling her daughter into her arms. "Emma, oh thank God you're safe." Tears of relief streamed down her face as she checked her child for injuries. "The guard man saved me, Mummy," Emma said, her voice still shaky but filled with gratitude. The angry man was going to hit me, but the guard man stopped him. Emma's father, a tall man with worried eyes, looked up at Marcus with profound gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of a parent's deepest appreciation. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. It was the right thing to do, sir," Marcus replied, though he never took his eyes off Pemberton, who was still seething with rage. Captain Reynolds moved closer, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Marcus had served under him for 3 years, and the captain knew him to be one of his most reliable and disciplined guards. But this breach of protocol was unprecedented, and there would be consequences that neither of them could avoid. "Thompson, I understand your motives, but you've created an international incident. The protocols exist for a reason. We cannot have guards abandoning their posts whenever they personally disagree with a situation. With respect, sir," Marcus said, finally turning to face his superior. "The protocols never anticipated a situation where we would be ordered to stand by and watch the assault of a child." Pemberton's face grew even darker. "Assault? You dare accuse me of assault? I'll add slander to the charges I'm bringing against you. By tomorrow you'll be ruined, finished, destroyed." But something had changed in the crowd's mood. The tourists who had witnessed the entire scene were no longer simply passive observers. People were speaking up, their voices growing stronger as they found courage in numbers. "He was going to hit that little girl," called out a woman with a German accent. "I saw it with my own eyes." "The guard did the right thing," shouted a man from somewhere in the back of the crowd. "Someone had to protect her." An elderly gentleman pushed forward, his face stern with indignation. "Lord Pemberton, I've known your family for 40 years, and I'm ashamed of what I witnessed here today. To threaten a child in such a manner is beneath contempt." The support from the crowd seemed to enrage Pemberton further. He was accustomed to deference, to people backing down when faced with his title and connections. But these tourists had no reason to fear him, and their condemnation was cutting deeper than any official reprimand ever could. Emma's mother stood up, still holding her daughter close. "Officer," she said to Marcus, "I don't know your name, but I want you to know that you're a hero to us. You risked everything to protect our little girl." "Thompson," Marcus replied quietly. "Guard Marcus Thompson." "Well, Guard Thompson, our family will never forget what you did today. If there's ever anything we can do—" Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the emotional moment like a blade. "Thompson, regardless of the circumstances, you disobeyed a direct order and abandoned your post. I have no choice but to place you under arrest pending a full investigation. Please surrender your weapon and accompany me." The crowd's reaction was immediate and vocal. Shouts of protest erupted from every direction, people calling the arrest unfair and unjust. Someone started clapping for Marcus, and soon the applause spread through the entire gathering, a sound that seemed to echo off the palace walls themselves. Marcus unbuckled his ceremonial sword and handed it to Captain Reynolds, his movements precise and military despite the chaos around him. "I understand, sir. I'm ready." But as he prepared to leave with his superior, Lord Pemberton made one final mistake. Perhaps it was the frustration of seeing Marcus treated like a hero. Or maybe it was simply his inability to accept that anyone would defy him. But he stepped forward and grabbed Marcus by the arm. "Don't think this heroic act will save you," he hissed. "I have friends in Parliament, connections you can't imagine. By the time I'm finished with you, you'll be lucky to find work as a street sweeper." The crowd fell silent, watching this final confrontation between the disgraced lord and the guard, who had defied everything to protect a child. What happened next would determine not just Marcus's fate, but would send ripples through the very foundations of British society. Marcus looked down at Lord Pemberton's hand gripping his uniform sleeve, then back up to meet the aristocrat's eyes. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the dynamic between them. The guard who had spent years following orders without question was gone, replaced by a man who had found his moral center and refused to be moved from it. "Sir," Marcus said with quiet dignity, "I suggest you remove your hand from my uniform." The crowd had gone completely silent, sensing that this was a pivotal moment. Even Captain Reynolds seemed frozen, uncertain how to handle this unprecedented situation. The traditional hierarchies that had governed British society for centuries were being challenged right here on the palace grounds. Pemberton's grip tightened instead of loosening. "You'll address me as my lord, you insolent peasant. Do you think your little display of heroics changes anything? Do you think the rabble's applause matters to people who actually matter? I think, Marcus said, gently but firmly removing Pemberton's hand from his sleeve, that protecting an innocent child matters more than any title or rank. And I think that's what actually makes someone matter. The words hit Pemberton like a physical blow. His entire worldview was built on the assumption that birth and privilege automatically conferred worth and authority. To be told by a mere guard that his actions, not his title, determined his value was intolerable. "You dare lecture me about worth?" Pemberton snarled. "I am descended from kings. My family has served the crown for 800 years. What are you, nothing?" A common soldier in a fancy uniform. Emma, still in her mother's arms, looked up at Marcus with wide eyes. Despite being only 8 years old, she seemed to understand that something important was happening. "Mummy," she whispered, "why is the angry man so mean to the nice guard?" Her innocent question carried across the silent courtyard, and several people in the crowd were visibly moved by it. Here was a child who could see clearly what the entitled lord could not. That kindness and courage were more valuable than any inherited privilege. Captain Reynolds finally found his voice. "Lord Pemberton, I must ask you to step back and allow us to handle this situation according to proper military procedures." But Pemberton was beyond listening to anyone now. His face was twisted with rage and humiliation as he realized that not only had this common guard defied him, but he was being supported by everyone present. The natural order of things as he understood it was collapsing before his eyes. "This is what's wrong with this country," he shouted, addressing the crowd now. "No respect for proper authority. No understanding of the natural hierarchy. These people need to be reminded of their place." An elderly woman in the crowd stepped forward. She was well-dressed and spoke with the accent of educated upper-class Britain. "Lord Pemberton," she said with ice in her voice, "I am Lady Margaret Ashworth, and I've known your mother since we were girls at school together. She would be mortified to see how you've disgraced the family name today." This intervention from someone of his own social class seemed to shock Pemberton into momentary silence. Lady Ashworth continued, her voice carrying the authority that came from genuine nobility of character rather than mere birth. "This young man," she gestured toward Marcus, "has shown more honor in the last 10 minutes than you've displayed in your entire adult life. You should be thanking him, not threatening him." The crowd murmured approval, but Pemberton's humiliation only deepened. Being criticized by his social equals was even worse than being defied by those he considered beneath him. His hands clenched into fists as he struggled to maintain any semblance of dignity. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading far beyond the palace gates. Social media posts with videos and photos were going viral, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story. The hashtag #Guard Hero was trending, and messages of support for Marcus were pouring in from around the world. Inside the palace, senior officials were watching the scene unfold through security monitors. The situation was becoming a public relations nightmare, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Instead of criticism for the guard's breach of protocol, the palace was being flooded with calls and emails praising Marcus's actions and demanding that he be commended, not punished. Captain Reynolds received a message through his radio that made him pause. He listened intently, his expression changing from stern disapproval to something approaching surprise. When the message ended, he looked at Marcus with new uncertainty. "Thompson," he said quietly, "I've just received word that Her Majesty herself has been briefed on this situation. She wishes to speak with all parties involved." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The Queen's personal involvement in the incident elevated it from a simple breach of protocol to a matter of national significance. Pemberton's face went pale as the implications sank in. His threats and bluster suddenly seemed very hollow when faced with the prospect of explaining his actions to the monarch herself. Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, is the Queen coming to see the nice guard man? Will I get to meet her?" Her mother smiled despite the tension of the situation. "We'll see, sweetheart. But remember, the guard man's name is Mr. Thompson." Emma nodded solemnly, then looked up at Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, will you get in trouble for helping me?" Marcus knelt down to Emma's level, his stern military bearing softening as he addressed the child he had protected. "I don't know what's going to happen, Emma, but I want you to remember something important. Sometimes doing the right thing means you might face consequences, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. My daddy says that too," Emma replied. He says being brave means doing good things even when you're scared. Your daddy is a very wise man, Marcus said, glancing up at Emma's father, who nodded gratefully. Lord Pemberton watched this exchange with growing desperation. The narrative was slipping completely away from him. What had started as his justified anger at being inconvenienced had become a story about a heroic guard protecting an innocent child from a bullying aristocrat. The videos circulating online would ensure that this version of events became the official truth in the court of public opinion. This isn't over, Pemberton said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. I have resources, connections. The truth will come out. Lady Ashworth fixed him with a withering stare. The truth is already out, Lord Pemberton. The only question now is whether you have enough character left to acknowledge it and make amends. As if summoned by her words, a new group of officials appeared at the palace gates, moving with the purposeful stride of people on urgent business. The final act of this unprecedented drama was about to begin. The palace gates opened with ceremonial precision, and 3 figures emerged that commanded immediate attention. At the center walked Sir James Whitmore, the Queen's private secretary, a man whose calm demeanor masked one of the sharpest political minds in Britain. Flanking him were 2 senior palace security officials, their faces grave with the weight of their mission. The crowd instinctively parted as they approached, sensing the gravity of official royal business. Even Lord Pemberton seemed to shrink slightly in the presence of such direct representatives of the crown. Captain Reynolds snapped to attention, his years of military training taking over despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. Sir James surveyed the scene with experienced eyes, taking in the scattered flower petals, the positioning of all the players, the cameras still recording from every angle. He had managed royal crises for 15 years, but nothing quite like this had ever crossed his desk. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir James announced, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, I bring a message directly from Her Majesty the Queen. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of London traffic seemed to fade as everyone strained to hear the royal pronouncement. That would determine Marcus's fate. Her Majesty has reviewed the reports of today's incident and has watched the video footage that has been provided to the palace. She wishes it to be known that she finds Guard Thompson's actions to be entirely commendable and in keeping with the highest traditions of service and honor. A cheer erupted from the crowd, but Sir James raised his hand for continued silence. However, Her Majesty also recognizes that protocols exist for important reasons, and that this matter requires careful consideration of both the specific circumstances and the broader implications for royal security procedures. Marcus felt his heart racing. The Queen's support was more than he had dared hope for, but the careful diplomatic language suggested that his future was still far from certain. Sir James continued, Therefore, Her Majesty has ordered that Guard Thompson be commended for his courage and moral clarity, while also directing a full review of current protocols to ensure that future situations of this nature can be handled with appropriate flexibility. Emma clapped her small hands together with delight. The Queen likes the nice guard man, she announced to anyone who would listen, causing several people in the crowd to smile despite the tension. But Sir James was not finished. His gaze turned to Lord Pemberton and his expression grew noticeably cooler. Her Majesty also wishes to address the conduct that precipitated this incident. The Crown has always expected those who hold titles and positions of privilege to conduct themselves with dignity and restraint, particularly in public settings. Pemberton's face went through several shades of red as he realized that the royal displeasure was now focused squarely on him. His earlier threats about connections and influence suddenly seemed laughably inadequate when faced with the disapproval of the monarch herself. Lord Pemberton, Sir James said, addressing him directly, Her Majesty requests that you present yourself at the palace at your earliest convenience to discuss today's events and their implications for your continued role in various royal patronages. The words were diplomatically phrased, but everyone present understood their true meaning. Pemberton's behavior had not only been witnessed by hundreds of tourists and recorded for the world to see, it had also earned him a royal reprimand that would likely cost him dearly in terms of social standing and official positions. Captain Reynolds stepped forward. Sir James, what are your instructions regarding Guard Thompson's current status? Guard Thompson will return to his duties immediately, Sir James replied. However, he will also be temporarily assigned to special duties while the protocol review is conducted. Her Majesty is particularly interested in his perspective on how royal security procedures might be improved to better serve both the crown and the public. Marcus could barely believe what he was hearing. Not only was he avoiding punishment, he was being asked to help reform the very system he had defied. The irony was not lost on him, and he struggled to maintain his military composure. Emma's mother approached Sir James with respectful hesitation. "Excuse me, sir. We're tourists from Canada, and we just wanted to thank everyone for how this was handled. Our daughter could have been seriously hurt if not for Guard Thompson's intervention. Her Majesty is aware of your family's situation," Sir James replied with a warm smile. "She has asked me to convey her personal thanks for your understanding during this difficult incident, and to extend an invitation for your family to attend a private audience later this week, if your travel schedule permits." Emma's eyes went wide with wonder. "Really, we get to meet the Queen? Because the guardman saved me?" "Because you were very brave during a scary situation," Sir James corrected gently. "And because your parents raised you to be such a polite young lady." The crowd began to disperse as people realized that the main drama had concluded, but many stopped to shake Marcus's hand or offer words of support. The videos and photos taken during the incident would continue to spread around the world, turning the unknown royal guard into an unlikely symbol of moral courage. Lady Ashworth approached Marcus as he prepared to return to his duties. "Young man, you should know that what you did today has restored many people's faith in the idea that doing right still matters, regardless of the personal cost. Thank you, my lady, but I only did what anyone should have done in that situation." "No," she replied firmly. "Most people would have found reasons to look the other way, to let someone else handle it to protect their own position. You chose to act when action was needed, and that makes all the difference." Lord Pemberton had remained silent through most of these exchanges, his earlier bluster completely deflated. As he prepared to leave, he paused near Marcus, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been grudging respect. "This isn't how the world is supposed to work," he said quietly, speaking more to himself than to Marcus. "No, sir," Marcus replied, "but maybe it's how the world should work." Pemberton stared at him for a long moment, then walked away without another word, his expensive shoes clicking against the cobblestones as he disappeared into the London crowds. Emma and her parents were the last to leave, the little girl insisting on giving Marcus a hug before they went. "Thank you for being brave," she whispered as her small arms wrapped around his legs. "Thank you for reminding me why being brave matters," he whispered. Beck, as the courtyard finally returned to normal, Marcus took his position at his post, but everything had changed. He was no longer just a ceremonial guard following ancient protocols. He had become something new, a bridge between the old traditions and the moral demands of the modern world, a living reminder that sometimes the greatest service to the crown required defying its rules. 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in the same courtyard where his life had changed forever, but now he wore a different uniform. The red tunic was the same, but new insignia on his shoulders marked his promotion to senior guard and his special assignment as protocol reform advisor. The irony still made him smile. The guard who had broken protocol was now helping to rewrite it. The changes that had emerged from the royal review were subtle, but significant. Guards were now trained in conflict de-escalation and given clearer guidelines about when humanitarian intervention took precedence over ceremonial duties. More importantly, a new culture had emerged within the Royal Guard, one that emphasized the spirit of service over blind obedience to rules. Marcus had become something of a celebrity, though he remained uncomfortable with the attention. Articles had been written about him in newspapers around the world, and he had received thousands of letters from people who had been inspired by his actions. The letter he treasured most came from a young police officer in Australia who had written, "Your example gave me the courage to stand up when I saw injustice in my own department. Thank you for showing us that doing right matters more than following orders." But the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus had been summoned to a private audience with the Queen herself. He had expected a formal ceremonial meeting, but instead found himself in a comfortable sitting room, sharing tea with a woman who seemed genuinely interested in his perspective. "Guard Thompson," she had said, "in my many years on the throne, I have learned that the true measure of any institution is not how well it follows rules, but how wisely it adapts those rules to serve justice and humanity. You reminded us all of that truth. The conversation had lasted nearly an hour, ranging from Marcus's childhood to his military service to his hopes for reforming the guard protocols. What struck him most was the Queen's genuine interest in ensuring that future guards would have the guidance they needed to make moral decisions without sacrificing their careers. As for Lord Pemberton, his fate had been quite different. The royal displeasure had indeed cost him dearly. His patronages had been quietly withdrawn, his invitations to state functions had ceased, and his social standing had crumbled under the weight of public condemnation. More significantly, the video of his attack on the photographer had led to criminal charges, and he was currently serving community service while attending court-mandated anger management classes. But even Pemberton's story had an unexpected twist. 2 months after the incident, he had appeared at the palace gates asking to speak with Marcus. The meeting, arranged through official channels, had been awkward but revelatory. "I've been thinking about what you said," Pemberton had begun, his earlier arrogance replaced by something resembling humility, "about actions mattering more than titles. My therapist says I need to make amends, not just for legal requirements, but for my own soul." The conversation had been difficult and sometimes heated, but it had ended with Pemberton volunteering at a children's charity, genuinely trying to understand the value of service over privilege. Marcus doubted the man would ever fully change, but the effort itself was more than anyone had expected. Emma and her family had indeed met the Queen, an encounter that had delighted the 8-year-old beyond measure. They had also kept in touch with Marcus, sending him photos and letters about their continued adventures. Emma's latest drawing, pinned to the wall in his quarters, showed a stick figure in a red uniform with a cape, labeled, "My Hero Guard Man." The broader impact of the incident had been profound. The phrase "doing a Thompson" had entered British slang, meaning to stand up for what's right regardless of personal consequences. Several other instances of guards and police officers intervening in similar situations had been reported, suggesting that Marcus's example was inspiring others to act on their moral convictions. Captain Reynolds, initially furious about the breach of protocol, had eventually become one of Marcus's strongest supporters. The review process had shown that the rigid adherence to ceremony had sometimes prevented guards from fulfilling their deeper duty to protect and serve. Reynolds now oversaw training programs that emphasized moral reasoning alongside traditional discipline. On this particular morning, as Marcus took his position at the palace gates, he noticed a familiar figure in the gathering crowd of tourists. It was a young woman in a teacher's uniform, leading a group of school children on what appeared to be an educational visit. As they approached the fence, Marcus heard her explaining the significance of the royal guard to her charges. "The guards you see here don't just protect the Queen," she was saying. "They protect the idea that service and honor matter, that doing right is more important than following rules blindly." 6 months ago, one of these guards proved that by protecting a little girl who was in danger. One of the children, a boy of about 10, raised his hand. "Miss, do you think I could be a guard when I grow up?" "If you study hard, stay strong, and always remember to be kind to others, you might be," the teacher replied. "But remember, being a real guard means being ready to do the right thing even when it's difficult." Marcus smiled behind his ceremonial stoicism. The teacher was right. The real duty of a guard or any person in a position of trust was to serve something larger than themselves. Rules and protocols had their place, but they were tools to serve justice, not obstacles to it. As the morning progressed, Marcus reflected on how much had changed, not just for him personally, but for the institution he served. The Royal Guard was still ceremonial, still bound by tradition, but it was also more human, more connected to the people it ultimately existed to protect. The incident with Emma had taught everyone involved that true authority came not from titles or uniforms, but from the courage to act on moral conviction when action was needed. It had reminded the palace, the public, and Marcus himself that the greatest service to the crown was sometimes found in the willingness to question its commands. A new group of tourists gathered near the fence, and Marcus noticed a little girl with curly hair pointing excitedly at his uniform. For a moment, he was transported back to that chaotic morning when everything had changed. But now, Instead of fear and conflict, there was wonder and respect in the child's eyes. Marcus Thompson had learned that sometimes breaking the rules was the most loyal thing you could do. And in a world that often seemed to value conformity over courage, that lesson had proven to be exactly what everyone needed to. Here the guard who had defied orders to protect a child had become a symbol of something timeless and essential. The idea that true honor lay not in blind obedience, but in the wisdom to know when compassion must override protocol, when humanity must triumph over hierarchy, and when doing right mattered more than anything else in the world.